I'm just a grandmother who once believed that love meant staying quiet and doing the dishes. They never asked me to sign a contract. No one shook my hand or gave me a title. But the moment I moved in with my daughter after my husband died, I stopped being her mother and started being her maid. It began small the way most betrayals do. A gentle request here. A could you or would you mind there? At first I didn't mind. Of course I didn't. I wanted to help. I needed to feel useful. After all, they'd opened their home to me. But somewhere between the school drop-offs and the dinner cleanup, something shifted. I stopped being welcome and started being expected. 6:30 a.m., I was up making lunches. 10 a.m. laundry. Noon vacuuming and organizing the pantry because Mom the housekeeper is too expensive. Evenings babysitting. And every time I dared to take a moment for myself to read, to rest, to just breathe, my daughter would look at me like I'd stolen time from her. One day I asked, "Can we have a little family dinner out together sometime?" She blinked. "Oh, Mom. It's just hard with the kids and work, you know." But 2 days later, they posted photos from a sushi dinner with friends. I wasn't invited. I was at home, washing her kids' pajamas. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't family anymore. I was staff. Except staff get paid. Staff get time off. Staff don't cry quietly in their rooms after folding the 7th load of laundry. No one hit me. No one yelled. But every day I disappeared a little more. Beneath the casserole dishes. Behind the "thanks, Mom, you're the best." Underneath the never-ending expectations of a woman who once raised a family and now couldn't even ask for respect. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Because mothers, we endure. We swallow the pain. Tell ourselves it's temporary. That they're just tired. That they don't mean it. But deep inside me, something had started to boil. And the day it spilled over was the day they handed me a chore chart. For me, color-coded, pinned to the fridge. Like I was the hired help. That was the day I looked at my daughter, not with tears, not with rage, but with something colder, clearer. "I am not your maid," I said. "I am your mother, and I will not be treated like I'm lucky to be tolerated." She blinked, like she hadn't seen me in a while. Maybe she hadn't. That was the day I stopped being quiet. That was the day I remembered who I was. That was the day I said no. I used to think there was no limit to what I'd do for my family. I wiped fevered foreheads at 3 a.m., juggled bills to keep food on the table, and held my husband's hand when he died gasping for breath. I thought all of that made me strong. Maybe it did. But what I didn't know, what no one tells you, is that love without boundaries turns into servitude. After my husband passed, I had nowhere else to go. Susan said, "Stay with us, Mom. We'll take care of you." She said it like a promise, but it became a sentence. The first few weeks were warm. The kids crawled into bed with me in the mornings, and Susan brought me tea. I thought, maybe this is healing, but the warmth cooled fast. Suddenly, I was the one doing the morning routine, then the laundry, then every dish. No one said thank you. Not once. I tried to speak up once. "I think I need a bit of rest today," I told Susan after 5 straight days of nonstop chores. She didn't even pause. "Well, can you at least fold the towels? They've been sitting in the dryer since yesterday." And I did it. Because of course I did. Because somewhere deep inside, I still believed that helping meant they loved me. That staying useful meant staying wanted. But then came the chart. Color-coded tasks, labeled by days. Stuck to the fridge with a smiling magnet that said, "Family, teamwork." Only I was the only one on that team. Tuesday vacuum living room, Thursday grocery list, everyday dishes, laundry, dinner prep. No signature, no conversation. Just expectation. When I brought it up, Susan laughed. "Oh, come on, Mom. You're always saying how bored you are." I wanted to scream. I wasn't bored. I was lonely, invisible, trapped in a house where I cooked every meal, but no one asked if I'd eaten. That night, I sat in the guest room, my space with the peeling wallpaper and the second-hand blanket. And I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to whisper before. If I disappeared, would they notice anything but the undone dishes? That's when the real hurt began, because I knew the answer. And still, I stayed. Because mothers, we keep loving even when it bleeds us dry. But the bleeding was starting to stain. And eventually, even invisible women leave marks. It was my 71st birthday. I hadn't expected much, just a small dinner, maybe a card, a warm hug from the kids, a simple, "We love you, Grandma." But when I woke up that morning, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I waited until noon. No one said a word. At first, I told myself they must be planning a surprise. Maybe the kids were hiding in the kitchen with cake frosting on their cheeks, waiting to jump out with smiles. But the hours passed. Lunch came and went. I made grilled cheese for them. No one made anything for me. Still, I waited. At 6:15 p.m., I heard the front door open. Susan's voice, tired and flat, floated in. "Mom, can you heat up the leftover casserole? We're starving." I stepped into the hallway. I thought maybe we were going to eat together tonight. She blinked, confused. "Why?" I didn't answer. Just stood there. She looked at the calendar. "Oh, right. Happy birthday," she mumbled, and disappeared into the living room. That was it. No card. No candle. No hug. Just a leftover casserole and a woman who had become a ghost in her own family. I didn't eat that night. I sat in the garage instead, in a folding chair next to boxes of things that used to be mine. My wedding photos, my cookbooks, a lamp from my old living room. They were collecting dust in the dark, just like me. And I cried. Not loud, not angry. The kind of cry that leaves you hollow. Because it's not just about being forgotten. It's about realizing you were never remembered in the first place. The next morning, I wrote in my notebook. I gave them my years, my back, my hands, my youth. And now, I can't even get a candle on a cake. This isn't love, this is use. That day I didn't clean. I didn't cook. I didn't speak. And no one noticed. Not even the kids. And in that silence, I found a new kind of voice. A quiet, steady one. It didn't shout. It promised. This ends soon. It started small. I simply didn't fold the laundry. Normally, I would have it all done before they even asked. Shirts pressed, socks, paired, the baby's onesies lined up like soldiers. But that day, I just let the dryer buzz and buzz and buzz. No one said anything for an hour. Then Susan finally called out, "Mom, did you forget the clothes in the dryer?" I replied without flinching, "No, I just didn't feel like folding them." There was a silence I hadn't heard in years, shocked silence. Later, she came into my room. Her arms were crossed, her eyes confused and defensive. "Are you okay?" I looked her straight in the eye and said, "I'm tired, Susan. Not sick, not angry, just tired of being the maid." Her lips parted, maybe to argue, but I kept going. Tired of living in this house like a shadow. Tired of being invisible unless there's laundry to fold or dishes to clean. Tired of celebrating your birthdays and being forgotten on mine. She didn't expect that. I could see the flinch behind her pride. That evening, for the first time in a long while, I sat outside in the garden alone with no chores waiting, no calls for Grandma breaking the air. And you know what? The world didn't fall apart. Dinner still happened. Clothes didn't vanish. Life went on. But for me, it was the start of something seismic. I realized something vital that night. They never asked me to be their maid, but they never stopped me either. And the longer I allowed it, the more they believed it was who I was. The next day, I wrote 3 words in my notebook. No more silence. I didn't scream. I didn't slam doors. But I started saying no. No, I won't babysit tonight. No, I'm not making dinner for 12. No, I'm not going to your PTA meeting because you're too tired. With every no, my spine straightened. With every no, I remembered the woman I used to be before they turned me into a helper with a heartbeat. And the kids, they noticed. They didn't understand, but they noticed, and it was just the beginning. It's funny how a single no can echo louder than a scream. After years of serving quietly, the absence of my usual chores, no warm breakfast laid out, no folded towels in their baskets, no morning lunch boxes hung in the air like thick fog. No one said anything directly, but I could feel it. The tension, the confusion, the fear. They walked softer around me now, unsure if Grandma had finally lost it. Or worse, found herself. I remember Susan asking cautiously, "Mom, is something wrong? You've been distant." I smiled politely, not coldly, and said, "Nothing's wrong. In fact, things are starting to feel right for the first time in a long while." She blinked, like I'd spoken another language. She didn't know how to respond. because all her life she only knew me in one role, the giver. She didn't know the woman before she became just mom or grandma. But I remembered. And she was coming back. That Sunday, I didn't go to church with them. I stayed in, brewed a pot of tea, and started a journal. I wrote about the girl I used to be, about the woman I became to keep the family together, and about the quiet rage that had lived in me for decades, tidy controlled, but never gone. When they came home, they brought takeout, something I never allowed. No one said anything, but I noticed how Susan placed my favorite drink beside me without asking. A small gesture, an olive branch, a hint that maybe they were beginning to see me, not as the maid, not as the housekeeper, but as a person, a woman, their mother. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just a shift, like a tide pulling away from the shore. Quiet but undeniable. The house began to adjust because I had, and I knew something now. Change didn't require a war. It just needed a boundary, and I was finally learning how to draw mine. One evening, I sat by the window with my tea watching the sunset, bathe everything in gold, quiet calm, but with a fire beneath. Just like me now. And something stirred in me. A feeling I hadn't touched in decades. So I pulled out my journal, turned to a blank page, and began writing a letter. Not one meant to be sent, but one that had to be written. Dear Susan and Matthew, I began. If you're reading this, it means I've finally chosen to tell you my truth. Not as your mother, not as your unpaid helper, but as a woman who once lost herself loving you. I wrote about the endless years of invisible work, the meals cooked without thanks, the nights spent worrying while they slept soundly, the birthdays I forgot to celebrate my own because theirs came first. I wrote about the way they looked at me like I was part of the furniture, useful, comfortable, but unseen. I didn't blame them entirely. I had allowed it. I thought that was love. I thought being needed was the same as being valued. But now, I knew better. I gave up dreams you never knew I had. Do you remember I once wanted to open a small bookstore? I had the name and everything. Pages and peace. But I traded those pages for school permission slips and grocery lists. Tears dripped on the paper, but I didn't stop writing. I am not angry anymore. I am awake. I'm not writing this for apology. I'm writing it so you might finally see me. I folded the letter. I placed it in the drawer with no intention of delivering it. But just having written it felt like placing a stone down after carrying it for a lifetime. I didn't need to yell anymore. My silence had already begun to speak volumes. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a peace I hadn't known since I was a girl. It was the peace of someone who finally said no. And meant it. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of relief in my chest, like a burden had been lifted quietly in the night. The letter I had written still sat in my drawer, unread by anyone but me, but somehow that was enough for now. Sometimes the act of declaring your truth even in private starts changing everything around you. I didn't rush to cook breakfast. I didn't make my usual morning calls to remind them about their groceries, their appointments, their world that I used to manage like a silent secretary. Instead, I sat by the window with my second cup of tea, and just sat. Around noon, my phone rang. Susan's name appeared. I stared at it, let it ring once, twice, 3 times, and then I put the phone back down. It was the first time in decades I had not answered a call from my daughter. It felt terrifyingly empowering. That afternoon, Susan showed up at my door. No warning, no smile, just her usual irritated sigh and a sharp tone, "Mom, why didn't you pick up? I've been calling." I looked her straight in the eyes and said gently, "Because I didn't feel like talking today." She blinked, confused, a little stunned. It was the first time in years she had heard me say no. And I could see it unsettled her. She stood there expecting me to invite her in, offer coffee, ask about her kids. But I didn't move. "I'm resting," I said. "Maybe we can talk another day." She left without another word, and I closed the door with shaking hands. But they weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking from the adrenaline of freedom. I sat on the couch after that, staring into the stillness of my little home. And for the first time in my life, I realized something so powerful. It almost took my breath away. You don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the quietest no carries the loudest echo. And I had just begun to echo. It didn't take long for the consequences of my no to ripple through the family. By the next weekend, my son called me more out of duty than concern. Susan said, "You were acting weird." "Everything all right, Mom?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it over the phone. "I'm just learning how to rest." He chuckled uncomfortably. "Well, let us know if you're feeling down. We've got a lot going on with the kids and work, but you know we're here." Are you really? I thought. Because I've always been there for you. Every single time. But I didn't say it. Not yet. Instead, I simply replied, "I appreciate that." That Sunday, no one came to visit. For the first time in years, my house was silent, not from exhaustion, but from absence. No shoes littered the doorway. No dishes piled in my sink. No voices demanding, "Where's the ketchup?" Or "Did you wash my uniform?" I should have felt lonely. But I didn't. I felt clean. Still, I won't lie, the silence wasn't always peaceful. Sometimes it wrapped around me like a fog, whispering cruel doubts in my ear. "You're pushing them away. You'll be forgotten. You'll die alone in this house." But I fought back with a stronger voice. "You've already been alone in crowds of people who only saw your usefulness." And now at least this solitude was on my terms. The real test came 2 weeks later when my granddaughter Jessica called. "Grandma," she said, voice quiet. "Why weren't you at Liam's game? We were looking for you." My heart softened instantly. Jessica was different. She always saw me. I paused and answered gently, I wasn't invited. There was silence on the other end. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry. That's not right." That night, I sat with Jessica's words replaying in my heart. I had made them uncomfortable. I had disrupted the system. But I was no longer a cog in their machine. I was a woman reclaiming her name. And slowly, just slowly, they were beginning to notice. In the quiet of those days, I started writing again. Not novels, not poems, but letters. Letters I never intended to send. To my son, "You used to run to me with scraped knees and wide eyes. I fixed your wounds. But when my heart bled, you looked away." To my daughter-in-law, "I offered you love, shelter, and respect. You repaid me with chores and criticism." To myself, "You were never just a maid. You were the glue, the warmth, the soul of the house." Writing these words didn't fix everything, but they cleared space in my heart. Like dust finally swept from corners long ignored. I realized I had been living as a ghost in my own life, present visible but unseen. Then something unexpected happened. Jessica began stopping by after school, alone. At first, it was just 20 minutes on the porch, then an hour over tea. Then full conversations about her dreams, her doubts, her thoughts on boys and books. One afternoon, she asked Grandma, "Why did you stop coming over?" I took a breath. "Because I started remembering who I was," I said. "And I couldn't keep showing up in a place where I didn't matter." She didn't argue. She just nodded. And that was all I needed. Weeks turned into months. Jessica came often. Her kindness watered the dry garden of my soul. I began smiling more, not forced, not polite. Real from the belly smiles. One night, I whispered to the silence in my bedroom, "I'm not invisible anymore." Not because they changed, but because I did. It was a rainy Thursday when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not him. Standing in the drizzle was my son, coat damp face, drawn eyes carrying a weight I hadn't seen in years. "Can we talk?" he asked. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to slam the door. But a deeper part, perhaps the mother in me, stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table, the one I bought myself. The one where no one shouted, no one ordered. Just tea peace and the hum of my new life. He didn't speak right away. His fingers tapped the mug nervously. Then he said, "I didn't realize how badly we treated you until you were gone." I stayed silent. He continued, "Jessica, she talks about you all the time. Says she's never met someone braver." My chest ached in the best way. He looked down. "You were never the maid, Mom. You were the backbone. And I let her convince me you were just convenient." The apology wasn't perfect. It didn't fix the past. But it was a start. He asked if I'd consider visiting for dinner. Not to cook, not to serve. Just To be there. I said I'd think about it, and I meant it. Because this time I had the power of no. No to guilt. No to being used. No to erasing myself again. But maybe yes to a new kind of family. One that had to earn my presence. Because I finally knew I wasn't desperate. I was deserving. I stood outside their house with a steady hand and a calm heart. It wasn't the same feeling I had when I used to walk through that door years ago, tired, anxious, bracing myself for a barrage of demands. This time, I wasn't walking in as the help. I was walking in as someone who had found herself again. Jessica opened the door. She looked surprised to see me dressed nicely, hair done, lipstick on a light scarf wrapped delicately around my neck. I was glowing, and I knew it. "Hi, Grandma," she said. A little awkward, a little unsure. "Hi, Jessica. You look taller than last time," I smiled. My son greeted me with an unsure hug. And for the first time, he didn't rush me toward the kitchen. He offered me a seat in the living room instead. Progress. They'd set the table already. The food was ordered in, not cooked by me. That alone told me something had changed. During dinner, I listened more than I spoke. They talked about work-school plans for the holidays. Then my son asked, "Do you remember that old rocking chair you loved?" I nodded. "We brought it back out, fixed it, painted it your favorite color." It was sitting by the fireplace when I walked in. Teal blue, polished, waiting. My eyes welled with tears, but I didn't let them fall. I simply sat, rocked back, and said, "This feels right." They were trying, and I could see it wasn't for appearances. It wasn't guilt either. It was respect growing in real time. I left that night feeling full, not from the food, but from recognition. The maid they once took for granted had returned as the queen of her own story. A few weeks after my visit, something unexpected happened. Linda, a sweet woman I had met at the church, called and asked me to speak at the local community center. "We've been running a support group for women who feel stuck, unseen, unheard, and your story, well, it could really help them." At first, I hesitated. Me speak in front of people? But then I remembered who I used to be, and more importantly, who I had become. I said yes. The day came. I wore my best blouse, the same one they once laughed at for being too bright for a woman my age. I wore it proudly, because I wasn't going to dim myself anymore. The room was filled with women of all ages, mothers, grandmothers, caregivers. Some looked tired. Some looked lost. I saw myself in all of them. I stood behind the podium, took a deep breath, and began. I was once treated like a maid in my own family. But the day I finally said no was the day I began living for me. Heads nodded, some eyes welled up. I shared my story honestly, not just the pain, but the shame, the guilt, the years of silence. And then I shared my turning point. You are not selfish for saying no. You are not cruel for choosing yourself, and you are not alone. After I finished, a woman came up to me and whispered, "I thought I was the only one. Thank you for helping me breathe again." That night, I realized my story wasn't just survival. It was a spark, a light for others stuck in the same darkness I had once lived in. It wasn't revenge I craved anymore. It was impact, healing, freedom. And now I was giving that gift forward. Word of my community talk spread faster than I expected. People started calling, neighbors, old friends. Even women from other towns wanted to hear me speak. But the call I didn't expect came from my daughter-in-law. "Mom," she said, her voice shaky, "we saw your talk online. We didn't know how bad things were." "I'm sorry. After years of treating me like I was just a shadow, an unpaid maid who existed to serve clean and stay quiet. Now they noticed. Now that others were praising me, now that strangers were listening, honoring me, learning from me. I took a deep breath. "I appreciate the apology," I said. "But this isn't about your guilt. This is about my freedom," she cried. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to comfort her. I wasn't cruel. I was clear. Days later, my son tried reaching out too. "Ma, we didn't mean to hurt you. We thought you were okay with everything." And that, I replied, was the problem. I didn't shout. I didn't scold. But every word I spoke came from the years they thought I didn't have a voice. "I raised you. I gave everything. And when I needed kindness, I got a list of chores. When I needed warmth, I got cold indifference. He was silent. And then he asked, "Can we fix this?" I smiled softly. Not a bitter smile, a peaceful one. That's not up to me anymore. If you want to rebuild something, start by looking at how you let it fall apart. I hung up the phone and sat quietly in my chair. Not sad, not angry, empowered. I wasn't waiting for their apology. I wasn't hoping for reconciliation, because I had already found something far more powerful than their approval. My voice, my worth, my peace. In the weeks that followed those phone calls, something surprising happened. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt empty, but in a good way, like a heavy weight had finally been set down. Like a house that had been cleaned from top to bottom. Like I could breathe again. I started writing more. Little reflections, moments from my past. Not just the painful ones, but the ones that made me smile too. Like when my grandson asked if I had superpowers, because grandma always knows when something's wrong. Like when I used to sneak chocolate into my purse during church just for the kids. Like the quiet mornings I'd watch the sun rise while the whole house slept, and I told myself, "Hold on, one more day. You can do this." And now I wasn't holding on. I was living. One of my reflections went viral. A short quote I wrote late at night. I was treated like a maid until I remembered I was a queen. And queens don't beg to be seen. That quote was shared thousands of times. And every time someone commented, "This is my story," I whispered, "You're not alone." At the senior center, I led a new workshop, Your Story Isn't Over. It wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. Women who had been silenced for decades began to speak. One cried as she shared how her daughter hadn't called her in years. Another confessed that she hadn't bought herself a new dress in over 20 years, always saving for her ungrateful son. And as they talked, as they healed, something bloomed in that room. Not bitterness, power. Because when we tell our stories, we remember we are not maids. We are not burdens. We are not background characters in our own lives. We are grandmothers, yes. But we are also survivors and warriors and phoenixes who rise even when the world tries to burn us down. A few months after that, I was asked to speak at a local community event, a small gathering for women over 60. Nothing fancy. They handed me the mic and said, "Just share your story, Grandma." And for the first time in a long time, I stood tall, without shrinking. I told them how I was once treated like a maid, how I folded laundry while crying quietly in the hallway, how I cooked meals for people who never said thank you, how I raised children who grew up to forget the sound of my voice, how I disappeared inside a house I once dreamed would be my kingdom. And I told them the most important part. The day I stopped apologizing for existing was the day I became free. The room went silent. Not out of awkwardness, but because they saw themselves in every word. I looked into their eyes and asked the question that still lingers in my heart. If not now, then when? When will we stop waiting to be loved and start choosing ourselves? That night, I walked home not as a forgotten woman, but as a woman who had finally forgiven herself. For staying too long, for loving too hard, for believing her worth had to be earned. I poured myself a cup of tea, curled up in my chair, and smiled at the moonlight dancing on my bookshelf. They took everything from me, my time, my energy, my peace, but they didn't take my spirit. And now my story belongs to more than just me. It belongs to every woman who has ever whispered enough and meant it. So if you are a mother, a grandmother, or simply a woman who has ever felt invisible, let me tell you this. You are not here to serve. You are here to shine. What would you have done if you were me? Tell me in the comments, because somewhere another woman needs to hear your story too. And she's listening.